Since the creation of the motion picture, mediocre action films have been a dime a dozen. Fantastic action movies are a much more rare breed. For every Die Hard, there's like 5 Speed 2s, and for every Terminator 2, there's like 50 Alien vs. Predators, etc., etc., etc. You get the point. There's a lot of bad action movies and not nearly as many great ones. Although it came out nearly a decade ago at this point, 2012's The Raid easily takes its place among the very best. Not only that, it paved the way for an even better sequel. Before we get started, click on the red subscribe button and that notification bell right next to it. That way you know whenever I post a new video. The Raid, also known in the United States as The Raid Redemption, is an action thriller from Welsh director Gareth Evans. Taking place in Jakarta and featuring an all-Indonesian cast, this is a balls-out, relentless action movie and a clear love letter to martial arts cinema. Please note that there will be some very light story spoilers. It's also important to know that while the dialogue in this film is spoken in Indonesian, there are English subtitles. The film opens up with a relatively young police officer named Rama saying his morning prayers, kissing his pregnant wife goodbye, and promising his father to, quote, bring him back. The him would be Rama's older brother, Andy, the family outcast who currently works for a crime lord on the top floor of a sprawling residential complex. This particular complex is in a shady part of town and is riddled with prostitutes, drug dealers, machete-wielding murderers, and hood rats. The landlord Tama is a really creepy old man who relishes his position at the top of the food chain. Unfortunately for Rama, he has 2 major problems to deal with. First, his brother doesn't just work for Tama, he helps oversee the entire drug operation centered in the complex. Second, the boss's other right-hand man is a complete psychopath named Mad Dog who relishes killing people with his bare hands and is more than capable of doing so despite his small stature. Mix all of this up in a bowl and you've got a relatively straightforward setup for all sorts of death and destruction. By keeping that runtime relatively short and the narrative easy to digest, The Raid uses that simplicity to introduce us to what amounts to the opening act of a 2-part epic. I'll get to this more next week when I review the sequel, but this film is as lean as it possibly gets. All of the action is self-contained in one area, and much like Dredd, which came out around the same time, this does wonders for ratcheting up the tension and keeping our nerves on edge. There are no massive car chases or dudes jumping out of airplanes, spoiler. This one is all about cramped hallways, dilapidated bathrooms, and dumpy apartments. Much of this tension is helped by the camera, which remains close to the action, even if it sometimes becomes a little bit too herky-jerky for my personal tastes. The straightforwardness of the story has both positive and negatives. On the one hand, it gives us something short, sweet, and easy to digest. It gives us a perfect setup for a greater universe that the sequel will expand upon. On the other hand, it doesn't really show us very much in the way of characterization. Rama is an intriguing protagonist, but what about his fellow police officers? We know absolutely nothing about any of them. We also don't know anything about what led up to the deterioration of Andy's relationship with his family. We know that he's a bit of an outcast, but that's pretty much it. Heck, I walked away from this knowing more about Andy's relationship with Tama and Mad Dog than I did about his relationship with his own family. Knowing what we know about the sequel, this is certainly disappointing. Neither film takes the time to get into these finer details, and that's a real shame. The all-Indonesian cast does a great job of selling the story. Iko Uwais does the majority of the heavy lifting in his role as Rama, and somehow manages to come off as soft-spoken and likable, while having all the physical tools necessary to kill literally anyone he comes across. Rama's earnest desire to save his brother provides just the right amount of emotional weight to the story, and he's perfectly suited to carry the franchise. The other big standout performance here comes from Yayan Ruhian, as the appropriately named Mad Dog. A constant blur of fists and feet, he provides a worthy foe to the soft-spoken Rama. While he's not technically the main villain, he easily provides the biggest physical threat to our hero and the entire police squad as a whole. As good as the performances are, we all really know what the most appealing part of a movie like this is. That would be the fights. And that's where The Raid really sets itself apart. The fight choreography, the bruising hits, and physical capability of the actors all make for some of the most brutal fights you will ever see. Because the good guys in this movie are all cops, they have firearms, but when the bullets run out, it's a non-stop barrage of fists and knives and machetes, while the limited space afforded by the film's location does make things feel claustrophobic, kudos to the filmmakers for milking every single ounce out of that setting. The Raid Redemption gets so much right that it's easy to look past the film's threadbare story and find a movie that manages to be insanely fun to watch. It also does an outstanding job establishing a world for the sequel to go bonkers with, something that only became noticeable well after both movies were released into the wild. If you enjoy action movies, you have no excuse not to dive into The Raid. Thank you so much for checking out the video. If you enjoyed it, click on that red subscribe button. You can also like and share the video, and that tells YouTube that my channel is worth promoting. Also, sound off down in the comments, let me know what you thought of The Raid, and I'll see you next Wednesday at 9 a.m. to talk about The Raid 2.